This lecture is called The Rise of Big Business. This would be target 6.05. We're going to first start with a question. And that question is, why does America become the leading industrial nation in the world, the #1 nation by 1900? To answer that question, we have to look at the Second Industrial Revolution, which is something you would have studied in World Studies last year. So a lot of the ideas you learned then are going to be similar to the United States. The first reason that answers why America becomes a leading industrial nation is that the United States has abundant natural resources. Because of the conquest of the West and the addition of territory through the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican War, there's a lot of gold, silver, timber, and other kinds of resources that can be used to help power the Industrial Revolution. Second, the United States has a very pro-business government, meaning our government is structured in a way to help businesses succeed. Even when business leaders are saying that the government is hands-off, it's not really true. For the most part, our government does a lot to make sure that businesses and capitalism in general are successful. Finally, there's a large supply of labor in the United States, especially with immigrants coming after the Civil War. And this large supply of labor means that labor costs are really cheap in America. Now, once these factors come together after the Civil War, there's a rather rapid industrial takeoff in the United States. And it has several results. For one, there's a conflict with labor. That is, workers feel like they're being abused, they feel like they're being cheated, and they organize and fight against the capitalist system. Second, there's a lot of environmental destruction. Because Americans think that there are plenty of resources to go around, they don't think that they might have to be careful in how they use them. So Americans burn up coal and oil, they destroy forests, they leave large holes in the earth where they've dug in mines. And this environmental destruction will eventually catch up with the United States in the 20th century. But for most of the 19th century, people just think the resources are never going to run out. Urbanization is an effect. As America grows, more people move here, businesses grow, they concentrate in large cities, particularly places like New York and Chicago. Mostly northern areas are going to see lots of industry. And finally, the growth of monopolies. And this is really true after the Civil War, as businessmen work really hard to beat their competitors and put them out of business. As that happens, the United States forms some of the largest corporations and some of the wealthiest men we've seen in American history. Here's an illustration of the environmental problems caused by the Second Industrial Revolution. You can see all of the smoke being released into the air. Things would have also been dumped into the water by these factories. And in the 19th century, lots of people just didn't understand or think that this was a problem. They felt like nature would take care of itself and that the resources would never run out. So it would never be a problem. Here's an example of how our government protects capitalism and protects the growth of business. Under the US Constitution, if you have a technological idea or an important way that you want to contribute to society through the creation of an invention, you can get a patent. A patent protects your invention or your technology from other people copying it and stealing your idea. And this graph shows a dramatic increase in patents, rising pretty sharply from 1860 all the way to 1909, with every year thousands and thousands and thousands of patents being issued to inventors. The result is a lot of monopolies after the Civil War. In the time period of the Gilded Age, a lot of Americans refer to the monopolies by the term trust. A trust is a specific kind of business that is created after the Civil War. And it's a situation in which a lot of small companies are run by a single board of directors. So it appears to be multiple companies, but in fact, all those companies are being controlled by one set of leaders. On one side of the argument, there is a belief that monopolies are inherently bad. For example, they tend to hurt consumer choice. If you can only choose between one or two companies for a business or for a service or for a good, that limits your ability to get the kind of service that you would like. It discourages competition. And for many people, competition is seen as a good thing because competition causes us to improve, to be better. We see that, for example, in monopolies where there is no reason to innovate because they control so much of a market, or they control so much of the buying and selling of a product that they don't see a need to make their product better. After all, everybody already buys what they sell. On the other hand, some people say that monopolies aren't inherently bad. For example, the better companies simply win out. The stronger companies survive and beat the weaker companies. So a monopoly is simply the survival of the fittest. Inferior businesses are driven out of the marketplace and replaced by companies that can really efficiently do a good job at creating a service or a particular good. Two ways that monopolies were formed in the Gilded Age were through horizontal and vertical integration. Horizontal integration occurs when one single company buys all the other companies that make the same product. For example, if you had a lot of independent oil refineries all being purchased by the same person to make one giant oil refinery, that creates horizontal integration. So all the same companies merging into the same product company. In this case, we have the example of John D. Rockefeller, who in fact created one of the largest monopolies in American history, Standard Oil, because at one point in time, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all oil production in the United States. On the other hand, there is vertical integration. In vertical integration, you have lots of different companies purchased by the same person, but those companies do not all make the same product. The goal here is that a businessman can own all of the various kinds of corporations needed to make and distribute the product he owns. And a good example here is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was the leading steel producer in the United States. So he had ownership of coke fields, which is needed in order to have material to heat the iron up. And so rather than buy that from someone, he just owned his own fields. He would own his own iron ore deposits so he could get the iron himself and melt it. He'd own his own steel mill so that he could melt this iron and make steel out of it. He'd own his own ships and railroads so he could then ship the iron or make products out of the steel that he made. So vertical integration basically amounts to owning everything you need to make and ship a product. There are also four majorly important ideas that increase monopolies in the United States after the Civil War. These pro-business ideas are going to be familiar to you from world studies. One of them is laissez-faire. And laissez-faire is the idea that the government should not regulate any business. In fact, the government should stay out of the way of businesses so businesses can do what they want. Going along with the idea of laissez-faire is social Darwinism, which says that the fittest businesses survive, and the government should not interfere with that process so that the strong businesses dominate, win, and the weak businesses die out. Another important idea is the idea of the self-made man. America thrives on the idea, the belief that if you work hard, that always gets success, which is not always the case in the United States. Sometimes working hard does not get success. But many of the leading monopolists of the 19th century will say that they worked their way up and that's how they became successful. And finally, another idea that justifies the monopolies and the extreme wealth they have is the gospel of wealth, which said that rich people are blessed by God. If God gives a person money, that person is blessed. So people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller must be loved by God. God must be blessing them. Carnegie went a step further and said that that wealth was given so that these pro-business people could help the poor. Not by going out in the street and handing out cash, but building libraries and hospitals and museums so that the poor could learn and be cultured and civilized. On the right is an illustration of the idea of the self-made men. This was a series of books called the Ragged Dick series, written by a minister named Horatio Alger Jr., who told Americans that if they worked hard, eventually they would find success and they would be rich and they'd be wealthy. So every story roughly is the same. The central character, a young boy, lives on the streets. He works hard, but he meets a wealthy businessman who recognizes he has potential. The wealthy businessman gives him a leg up in the world, and eventually the boy's got to decide, is he going to save his money and be successful, or is he going to have fun with his friends? And he has fun with his friends for a little bit, but then he says, I'm going to commit to working hard and I'm going to be somebody. And eventually ends up being a rich businessman himself. The idea of the social gospel is also illustrated in this cartoon, which shows Andrew Carnegie building a library out of building blocks. Carnegie was very famous for giving his money away for libraries and other institutions. In fact, the Columbus Metropolitan Library, the one downtown on Grant Street, was built with Carnegie money. And so if you go to that library and look outside, there's a plaque recognizing that fact. In the end, the United States was the most successful industrial nation on the planet by 1900. But there was a cost to that success. The cost was wild economic mood swings as companies wrestled against each other to try to get an advantage, and some eventually went and engaged in excessive behaviors, borrowed too much money, invested unwisely, and then caused economic crashes. You can see here the red line traces the ups and downs of the US economy after the Industrial Revolution takes off in the wake of the Civil War. So between 1873 and 1875, there is a little depression, actually triggered by several factors, but most notably a railroad goes bust. And then the economy improves and it booms, and then it crashes once more in 1884 with several things pulling it down then, but it's not too bad. And then there's another boom as the railroads are working, and then a huge collapse in 1893, also caused by people spending more than they have, abusing credit. So we have a tremendous amount of economic growth, but at the same time, it's wild and fluctuating. There's lots of highs and lots of lows as our monopolists are successful. So what we're going to have to look at over the next couple of days is the extent to which we should label the guys who made this possible robber barons or captains of industry. Do they deserve to be blamed for their excessive wealth and these economic mood swings? Or should they be celebrated as people who built the United States up into a major industrial power and also built the major infrastructure that we have today? Some of these guys are guys like Andrew Carnegie, major producer of steel in the United States. John D. Rockefeller, who owned 90% of oil production, also bought a lot of railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt owned railroads. And there are even people like Gustavus Swift, who was America's meat king. That is, he owned one of the most successful meat processing plants in Chicago. So should we vilify or hate these guys, or should we celebrate them?